Before we go any further, I wanted to get your thoughts on your outlook for the global economy 2015 and probably looking out beyond that as well. And then I'll introduce our star-studded panelists. I was suggesting that we had a chance to hear the outlook for Switzerland, how the currency exchange was handled. We're taking a bigger picture look at the developed world and the developing world for 2015 and beyond. So our question before we get started, and I get a chance to introduce our panel, is this. How do you think the global economic situation will develop over the next 12 months? Will it improve, stay the same, or get worse? How do you think the global economic situation will develop over the next 12 months? And go ahead and give us your comments. So as you vote, I'm going to go ahead and bring up our panel and give my opening remarks thereafter. Let's welcome in Bertrand Badré, he's the Managing Director and Group Chief Financial Officer of the World Bank. Paul Polman is the Chief Executive Officer of Unilever. Professor Martin Richenhagen is the Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of AGCO Corporation in the United States. And Siong Guan Lim, or SG Lim, is the Group President of GIC Private Limited, the sovereign fund out of Singapore. Please. And can we get the results of our synopsis here before we get started? Oh, the votes are still coming in. So 44% at this stage think that the situation will improve over the period. I'm doing that intentionally so we can get the stay the same muddle through life at 36% and get worse at 22%. So we're roughly here almost 50-50, improve or stay the same, and almost a quarter of you in the audience think that the situation will get worse. Well, how are we doing in 2015? This is an excellent panel in which to debate that very cause. It's interesting. I wouldn't say we're in a catatonic state right now. We're growing, but not phenomenally. There's no cataclysmic challenge on the horizon, at least as we see it at this stage. But clearly, we don't have clear line of sight or clear skies ahead. There's plenty of problems in the world to be worried about. Global growth of 3.5%. It's good. It's not extraordinary. The United States is moving along, but there's some concerns about overvaluations in the stock market and a property bubble forming because of what was discussed in the previous panel about very generous quantitative easing and the ability to keep interest rates where they are at this stage. In the Eurozone, growth of 1.5% perhaps for 2015, better than the less than 1% last year. Very late to the party to enter into this idea of quantitative easing. And as I discussed this morning with Her Excellency, the Finance Minister of Nigeria, the BRIC economies and the next 11 economies of the emerging markets have slowed down considerably. President Xi's China is slowing down, but still holding on to 6%. Prime Minister Modi is trying to reform in India, which is an important thing to do to try to revive that very large economy. But the commodity-driven economies of the world today are taking it on the chin. They've had a phenomenal run over the previous 10 years. I'm thinking of Brazil in particular, Nigeria because of oil, the belt in which I live in right now, the Middle East, enjoying very high oil prices, and all the commodities have tailed off, and that's affecting the developing world as well. So how do we navigate this sort of uncertain scenario, and can we get growth, global growth, above 5%? Or more going forward? It's fairly tidy order, but is it possible is the real question. Why don't I start from my left and ask you, Martin, you're in the agriculture machinery business. Based in the United States, 75% of your sales are outside the United States, and you're taking exposure in Africa, exposure in Russia, looking at different growth markets, Latin America as well. How do you feel, first, about the developing world and whether they can revive the growth that we saw 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, this is our hope. We had a good run, as you mentioned already, during the last years. Now commodity prices, so crop prices are down, farm income is down, and farmers basically hold investments back because of the many crises in the world. It's Ukraine, Russia, Greece, Southern Europe. So there's actually not so much good news around. Brazil, the president is not really doing so well and doesn't support the idea of investing a lot in Brazil right now. And overall, the hope is somewhat with certain emerging markets. And the only markets which were growing last year were Africa and Mexico for farming.
And do you expect the emerging markets, going to the point of our electronic poll there, do you think the emerging markets will improve in 2016?
Yes, I think Africa for sure. South America is pretty down. I hope that our industry did bottom out in the meantime. So we lost the industry was down from in 2014 by 10%, and this year another 20%. So that's a big hit because we were somewhat spoiled. So our industry was used to one record year after the other. And people thought it's the CEO of the company, but it wasn't the CEO, it was the market. They find that out now. And what you can do is you can actually use it as an opportunity to rethink your processes. We reduced headcount by about 10%, which I think is not a very intelligent idea, but you have to do it. And then you need to think about growth again. And for us, it's new products, new ideas. In our industry, we are in a leading position when it comes to precision farming. So we had already a unmanned tractor 10 years ago. The automotive industry is talking about it now. So those are the areas where we can offer new solutions which help farmers to become more productive and efficient, and that we think helps the company or might help the company to grow.
Okay, I want to come back to you in a number of different cases of how you've approached Africa, for example. I mean, 5 years ago, a third of what was grown in Africa never made it to the market because of wastage. And I know some of the sophistications going into the market. Bertrand, I think it would be interesting to get your view of how different central banks around the world are navigating through the challenges. We heard the Swiss example. We know that the ECB was very reluctant, in particular one leader in this in the Eurozone, being Germany, and Chancellor Merkel, very reluctant to go down the path that America chose to go down 4 years ago with the quantitative easing. Was the Eurozone reluctance going to hold back the recovery that we see as very tepid today?
Well, first of all, just a point of clarification. The World Bank is not a central bank. It's not the central bank of central bank. The central bank of central bank, as everybody knows, is in Switzerland, by definition in Basel. So this point being clarified, I'm very happy to discuss central bank issues, and I'm very happy in this room in particular because I've seen that Thomas has been receiving applause here. It's pretty rare that people applaud central bankers. There's been St. Gallen, so I feel in good territories. No, more seriously, you're absolutely true. The question and the answers that we receive show that we are typically in a position where you can see a glass half full and half empty. So the growth, as you say, is not stellar, but it's still better than a year ago. And for the first time in 5 years, most of the forecasts are revised upward. For the last 5 years, we continuously revise our forecast downwards. For the first time, it's a little bit upward. But the two main uncertainties that we are facing, which we might bring things in a different direction, and you say we don't anticipate any shock. A year ago, nobody anticipated the oil. And very few anticipated the divergence of monetary policies the way they've been expressed. And very little anticipated the decision of Thomas, actually, and others. So the two big factors, besides geopolitical aspects or typical situations like Greece, etc., are the price of oil and monetary policy. On the price of oil, as you said, the benefits are spread more or less across the board. Nice additional positive impact on India, on the EU, etc., widespread. The impact negative is concentrated in a few countries. You mentioned Nigeria, you could add Angola, Iran, to a certain extent Brazil, Venezuela, etc. Monetary policy, very difficult. You have this big question mark on the US monetary policy, which is the first question mark, because they are probably the first that are likely and prudent. to normalize their monetary policy through increasing the interest rate. For the time being, there is a discrepancy between market expectations and what the Fed is saying. And this is creating a lot of turbulence in emerging markets in particular. Because when you add oil plus uncertainty, this creates tension on a number of currencies, especially of the currencies of oil exporting countries, for instance. So this is, nobody knows exactly how it will happen. The minute it starts, will it be a smooth thing because it has been well prepared, etc., and then flows navigate okay, or will it be very brutal? Similar to what has been called the taper tantrum in 2013, when basically when Ben Bernanke entered at this, boom, 100 bips almost overnight. So US on the one hand. On the Eurozone, this is also, I mean, I don't want to comment on the internal discussion. At the end of the day, a decision has been made. And it is creating some turbulence on the market, including today and yesterday. I mean, the bond market is pretty difficult to decipher. It has an impact on the equity market. It's difficult. I mean, there are a lot of discussion on whether the QE is really causing what we are seeing in terms of rebounds of the European economy, or whether the announcement of the QE basically provoked the fall of the euro, which was on top of oil, helped propel the Eurozone engine, and so on and so forth. The issue now is a divergence between potentially hike of interest rates in the US and the situation where we are in Europe for a long time. It's unlikely to change for a long time. So do you expect that because of negative interest rates in Europe or slightly positive interest rates in Europe, let's be optimistic, the flows from Europe will go into emerging market and kind of counterbalance the impact of the US? That's the trillion-dollar question going forward. So for me, this is a big uncertainty. And in many respects, we are in uncharted territories. There is no real precedent to face this situation, so we can work, discuss. And I think that's why it's very important that we discuss, that we have these various groups that engage. I mean, the G20, the Financial Stability Board, at least people talk to each other. The question is, can you go into the insider trading? Do you think that the governor, and I will finish with, the governor of the Federal Reserve will give a call to Mario Draghi 5 days ahead and say, oh, by the way, let me tell you, I'm going to increase the rate next week. I don't think it's working this way. So it's pretty difficult to move on these big macro issues on coordination the way most people might think about it. It has to be done. It's extremely difficult, extremely sensitive. But this is, for me, the big question. The commodity prices probably likely to stay relatively low for a while. Massive uncertainty on the way, on the impacts of monetary policy, in particular with the two big reserve currency, which are the dollar and the euro.
So it's quite a shock that potentially could emerge here during this policy change, is what you're suggesting.
That's not our core scenario. Our core scenario is things are going slightly better. To a certain extent, you have some form of convergence. I mean, the US are doing better, but not as good as people expected. And the EU and the Eurozone is not doing as bad as expected. So instead of in divergence, you have some form of convergence. And same in Asia. If you consider, for the first time in many years, India is expected to grow faster than China in the coming years, both by IMF and the World Bank. So you have a convergence between East Asia and South Asia, which is pretty new, actually. So it's interesting. It's interesting.
For sure. I want to come back and address some of the risks that you were talking about, but let's make a round to the panel here. I think it's a good time, S.J. Lim, to bring up China, because it was brought up by Bertrand there. We were seeing the expectations just last year that China could hold on to 7% growth, but we see what President Xi and Premier Li are trying to do, engineer slower growth, deflate the bubble, but we've had a stock market that's gone up 80% since November. Will they be successful in managing what have been bubbles forming and trying to restructure the economy at a more sustainable rate?
Yeah, and the comment I can make from GIC, of course, is that I can't say what's going to happen next year, but on the general point about the direction China will take, and the GIC's view is that we're very positive about it. First, we think Xi Jinping, he understands the situation. He knows the challenges that he's faced with. He knows the solutions he needs to take, but the question is getting the timing right. Latest indications we had is that the Chinese feel that the new job creations that they are having, all the new jobs are being created in the services sector. And their sense of it, the services sector, productivity is lower, you get more jobs being created for the same change in GDP. So the impression that we are getting is that China feels that 6% of GDP will get them the number of jobs that they require. And therefore, the big concern that people have that China, anything less than 7% will be very difficult and so forth, we're not getting that indication in GIC. We're getting an indication that, that they think 6% will get the number of jobs. We know that jobs and social instability are the biggest threats, concerns of the Chinese leadership. And I think what we're saying is that it can go down to 6% and people still feel that they can live with that.
And can still manage it.
Right.
How about the worries of shadow banking and the debt at the local government level in China? Is it something we'll get visibility on realistically, or is this just a concern that will never surface to this point of a crisis that will reach beyond China's borders?
Recently, they've taken quite an interesting move. They made a swap arrangement where they've introduced municipal bonds, and municipal bonds are kind of guaranteed by the central government. And so they are urging the local governments to retire the bank loans that they've been taking, and they've issued instead municipal bonds, which have a lower interest rate, as I said, at the same time, and basically because the central government is guaranteeing the loans. So the way we look at it is that there's a certain deftness in all of this. There's an understanding of what needs to be done, and they are taking the moves. That's not to say that no accidents can take place along the way, but it's just our sense that that the leadership in China is clear about
where they want to go.
Where they want to go, what they need to do, and the difficulties that they are facing.
Very good. Paul Polman, it's interesting because you have to make decisions now, very much like Martin would, in terms of markets that you want to go into. Mrs. Ngozi was talking about the fact that you've chosen to go into Nigeria. We were on a panel together in Egypt, a very large market that's starting to stabilize. But I think it would be good to get your thoughts on what is your biggest worry for the second half of 2015, and perhaps something that could carry over that could really shake the global economy in 2016, in your view?
Yeah. Well, we're in about 190 countries in the world right now, so fortunately I don't have to make too many decisions where I want to go into, but it's really, you have to check is where is the long-term opportunity to grow. And if you look at the poll that you just did, it's about 60% of the people that say it's going to be equal or worse. And I happen to more or less agree with that, not from a negative point of view, but just from a realistic point of view. If you look since the crisis of 2007, 2008, if we take that as a starting point, global debt is up by 25 trillion. 80% of the households have more debt than it was at that point in time. I think the risk that has crept into the financial market, given the low cost, has actually gone up exponentially. The volatility has increased. We were in Davos, and you were there. We were there in end of January, and the biggest risk that people were in their yearly poll that they were talking about is the geopolitical uncertainties that we see right now all over the world, and that is occupying us. You take Europe, which is a good example. We might be very happy that we see 1.5% growth, but it's not real growth. And we will be very preoccupied with the Ukraines today and the Greece's tomorrow, but after 5 years talking Europe in a serious crisis situation, we haven't really moved the peanut forward, other than the de-risking of some of the banking sector, you might argue. But the economy is not moving forward. And the same in the US. The US might well be in recession in the first quarter when the final numbers come out. It's certainly going downwards, not upwards. And the question is really, you say we do 3.5% growth, so that's not a bad thing, and companies like ours can grow faster even in that environment, there's no doubt about it. But the question is, the way we measure growth, do we want actually more growth, or shouldn't we be starting to think about a different form of growth? I think in a world where we live right now, the main concern we have is that in the emerging markets, some of these structural issues are now being exposed, and they're not being addressed. It is said that Brazil is minus 1% or stability, as you were talking about. It's totally not needed, and it's a self-inflicted thing. It's said that Indonesia doesn't get off the ground, that South Africa is actually moving back. China slowing down is still a 6% or 7%, would be still an acceptable growth. The Modi's reforms will take a few years to implement. And if you look in Southeast Asia, I don't think the picture is that rosy. You see Thailand that has a lot of questions about the way that economy is going. Malaysia is fairly corrupt. Indonesia is not moving the peanut forward as fast as they should be doing. So we see these regions actually more regressing than progressing. And the thing that we need to focus on is not these myopic GDP numbers of growth, but we have to start figuring out how we want to run this economy, how we want to start addressing these issues that are holding us back. And it has to then lead to a more sustainable and equitable growth. We have to use this year to get binding and ambitious agreements on the climate change negotiations. We have to use this year to get ambitious agreements on the Sustainable Development Goals. If we can address those, and if the politicians of this world who are negotiating have enough courage to come out with something ambitious, I have more hope to the future. If not, we continue to live in a society where we produce economic growth numbers, but they're really to the benefit of few and to the cost of many. You take the United States, for example, one of our big markets, not surprisingly. They might say the United States is starting to grow again, but you look at the trillions of dollars that have been pumped into the economy with quantitative easing, and you look at the return, it has probably been one of the worst decisions that any businessman could have taken. If I would have run that business with that investment and that return, I wouldn't be sitting here and having my job. And I'm still in the job because we'll be a little bit more careful. And what you see in the US actually is an economy for companies like ours that is regressing instead of progressing. The numbers might say the economy is growing, but actually 70 million are living below the poverty line. 1 out of 5 kids doesn't go to school. The people that have work have significantly changed the definition of work or their income. And the same is happening right now in Europe. And those are our consumers. So our markets themselves, I'm not very realistic about that, unless we start figuring out how to create a more inclusive economic model. And this year is the ideal opportunity to do that.
I don't see the leadership to be candid. I mean, this is why people applaud, because they want to see that. They want to see a sustainable path forward, but we don't see the global leadership in that category. And I want to drill down, if we can, on different regions, and let's focus on Europe. If you look at the numbers of Italy, it's a G10 economy that hasn't grown in 5 years. And still there's no collective policy in the Eurozone to suggest that the Mediterranean matters. Isn't that a failure in itself for the Eurozone as a strategy?
Yeah, but you could... Right now, it's not anymore. The point is, first of all, it's too late to be a pessimist, and it's certainly not it's not either anymore. The issues that we are facing right now on climate change or on food security or inclusive growth are issues of such magnitude that it's not a question anymore to point fingers at our governments or the people that we have elected. It's clear that the global system that was designed to rule this world and deal with some form of interdependency that we've always had was designed in a period when 80% of the world economy was in Europe and the US, and we were doing pretty well with that. Now that we have a more balanced global economy, which obviously is better, we haven't really adjusted the institutions yet, and that's why we're struggling. And I think the best way to handle these things is not to point the fingers at this country or that country, but to proactively de-risk the political process. And what the business community should do, and should do even more so, is to come together, because they often are in more countries, they're often more longer-term focused, and say, for example, we want to tackle these issues. And instead of giving the majority of the voice to the minority, as, for example, happens in climate change, we have to work harder to have the majority be heard and be present and de-risk. For example, the consumer goods industry said, we are not going to sell any products anymore that come from illegal deforestation. The soy, the paper, the pulp, the beef, all the other things. That's 16, 17% of global warming. When the politicians saw the industry, and when they then realized it is directly linked to foreign direct investment, or it's linked to the image that the country might have, or the risk they take by not doing so, they started to act. Then you get responsible countries like Indonesia, like Singapore, that come in the act because they see the haze, they can't breathe either, and they say, we make it a criminal offense. Then you get NGOs that start measuring. Google Earth is a wonderful invention. You can now see on the meter in detail if the concession is burning or if it's an illegal operation. And you bring these coalitions together to de-risk political processes and move it forward. You do the same on youth unemployment. You do the same on some of the other elements of food security. I was with the former government in Italy when we were there, and we were saying you need job creation. You know, when you live in an economy where 50% of the youth are unemployed, like is happening now in Southern Europe, The issue is not the 50% unemployed. The issue is what will happen in one generation. What will these people think about the institutions that sort of represent them? What is social cohesion going to look like? So we need to all rally together to create these jobs. We are in the ice cream business, the Ben & Jerry's, the Magnums, all the things you all like here. And I hope you like the Ben & Jerry's, by the way. I heard that we provided them, so I just thought I'd put that one in. But Ben & Jerry's, by the way, is a brand that is totally driven by fighting these global causes, climate change or the same-sex marriage, the Australian coral reefs. And by the way, the brand is growing 10-15% in all the countries that we're in, because when you have a purpose like that, people gravitate towards it. But we need to sit together. When I went to Italy and I said, do you want 10,000 jobs or 5,000 jobs? They said, yes. I said, we can put more people on the street for selling ice cream. But the average cost for a company like ours is close to 30,000 euros because of all the charges. Italy is the country in Europe where the labor costs have gone up more, where the productivity has gone down, actually. And half of the cost that you pay doesn't get to the individual. And the answer I got was, well, we can't do it because Brussels doesn't let us. So we'd rather have these people be unemployed, deprived of the minimum dignity to get a job, to belong to something, to be seen as being contributing, for an economic system that we have developed that isn't functioning. So if we don't work together to change that, if we don't start lowering the tax on labor, for example, at a time that we need employment, and start increasing the tax on resources at a time that we use too much, it would be a good thing to me. And if they don't hear that from the business community with a more forceful voice, politicians won't have that courage to do it. We're running in Africa. You're talking about Africa, but Africa is a sad continent because it's one of the continents that is now importing food. We are big in Africa, but we even import food. Africa doesn't foresee in its own food security, which is a tragedy because they did it before. A country like Rwanda could supply, or sorry, a country like Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was called then, could supply the whole of Africa. Now the whole continent is importing.
That's a great point you bring up. I was going to bring Martin in because he's actually invested there. But you've taken a different approach that we talked about, which is actually providing training and looking at the entire food chain. I was talking about the fact that a third used to be thrown out because of the lack of a logistics network. Can Africa rise to the occasion here, as Paul suggested?
Yeah, I think I would agree to Paul, but I'm one step more ahead. It's not only so that we need to raise our voice, we have to become more active. Yeah. So politicians are not really good in developing businesses. And I think for me, Africa is a huge continent where we can develop a business model which helps the people of Africa. The population now is 1 billion this year and will be 2 billion in 20 years. We see all the African people coming to Europe. Europe is scared. They try to basically shut the borders. This will not work long term. They will come because the difference between Africa is just a few kilometers, Africa and the European continent. And so it's an interesting business model in a way that we can help the people in Africa and in the many states of Africa to do better in farming and to get into food security. They have the land. They have 60% of the world reserves in farmland. They have the right mentality. Africans are happy people. They're motivated. They like to do something, but they need to learn how to do it. We can help them to get there. We have a training facility, a big farm in Zambia, where we invite students, customers, farmers, and train them the whole process together with guys in seeding and fertilizing. And I'm really optimistic about the continent of Africa if we do it in the right way this time. So in the past, we did send money over or product, which was somewhat absorbed by corrupt politicians. And now we need to do it better. And we need to do business in Africa, which helps farmers to make money, which is important. So that needs the help. I need the help of Paul, because we can help farmers to produce crops. But this doesn't mean a lot, so they need to be in a position to sell it to a food processing company like his, and then we go.
Instead, you wouldn't have to import the food. Bertrand, to get your thoughts on Africa, because I think it's such a great opportunity, and we've moved away from the aid to the trade, of course. There's some question about some leaders that don't want to leave the podium. Some countries have gone through democratic transitions, like Nigeria, successfully without too much violence. How are you feeling about the continent itself?
Well, why do you say we have moved from aid to trade like this? We still are doing a lot of aid, so don't ignore that, and don't encourage that simple equation. We need both. We need aid, we need trade, and we need Paul and the others to join the effort. I was so happy when Paul mentioned that this year, 2015, is a very, very, very important year. We might not see it now, but in 20 years, I hope we'll say, oh, this was a turning point. We cannot miss it. I mean, in this world where everybody is going in different directions, which is fragmenting, which is kind of searching where we're heading to, I mean, despite all these forces which are leading us in many places, we have made the decision in July, in September, and in December to join forces and agree on something which is a bright future, where we need to work together. We need to work together. I mean, we made the decision to try to eradicate poverty by 2030. That is great. I mean, the first time in the history of mankind that we can say, okay, there might be no absolute poor within 15 years. It's like JFK saying in 1960, we go to the moon. Well, nobody believed him, but they went there. So we have to have this goal. That's extremely important, and the battle will be won or lost in Africa. You're absolutely right. So this is the year where we have to join forces. We have to keep the aid. Never forget about that. It's important. Even if it's 135 billion, it's not a lot, it's essential. There is no alternative to aid in many things. I mean, primary education in Africa, you will need aid. You need money. But you need much more than that. You need I mean, working with the private sector. We've been working with Paul on Ebola. I mean, Ebola is typically an example where it's been a failure. The way we addressed it collectively has been a failure. Lack of coordination, too late to put the money together, ignorance of the capacity of the private sector to help, etc. So we have to avoid this next time. And that's really the name of the game this year. This is the name of the game to finance development. This is the name of the game to finance climate. That's really, and this is the name of the game to find the jobs, where Paul is absolutely right and others. 15 years ago, it was just about aid and government and public money. This year, people realize we need 600 million jobs between now and 2030. 600 million jobs. Do you think we'll create 600 million civil servants jobs? And it's a French guy who says that, so you see?
Right.
No, the answer is, of course, no. It's not going to be just Unilever or AGCO or others. It's also going to be the economic sector on the ground. When you meet an African leader, his obsession, Ngozi and others, I have millions of young people coming to the market every year. I want to find a job for these people. So that's where we have to focus all our efforts. And that's where we can, by joining forces, by engaging public and private sector, by convincing the Nigeria of this world, which have been through an extraordinary transition. I'm just amazed. To mobilize also their resource, whether it's public resources, the way they tax their people, but also savings. I mean, Egypt has been able to gather $8 billion in 3 days to finance the Suez Canal out of the mattress.
Yes.
Mattress is not an appropriate solution. We have to build the system so that the savers feel entrusted to put his money at risk. So for me, it's extremely promising. It can be a great thing if we move forward, but it can also be a complete failure. We have to keep the momentum. We have to avoid the temptation not to get there. And that's why I'm very happy that we are all together to address this issue in 2015. That is critical. We cannot miss
target for 2030 if it can be accomplished. Yeah. I think it'd be good to hear from our 4 panelists before we take questions from the floor. The greatest risk for the next 18 months, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And there's plenty on the platform. I live in Abu Dhabi now, so in the UAE and surrounding us is Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, Libya, Iraq, plenty of problems in the Middle East. We saw Ukraine and Russia flare up for a couple of years. What does everybody put as the biggest global risk that could actually reach well beyond the borders there? Mr. Lim, do you want to tackle this?
Well, of course, I'm reminded of an Arab proverb which says that he who tells the future lies even if he tells the truth. So we need to approach this with a great deal of humility. As we look into what might happen in the next 18 months or so, I'm reminded that when you look at oil prices, the oil price dropped 50% in 6 months. Hardly anybody had been banging on the table or gone a loud hailer to say this is going to happen. But after it happened, the economists look at it and say that, the oil price may remain at this level for the next 18 months.
Which
Well,
didn't turn out to be true either.
Right. Okay. So now we have a situation where most of the time the economists who are supposed to give us some sense of the scenarios and how things are going and so forth, in fact, they're now becoming very good at describing the situation after it happens rather than telling you before it happens. So this, I must tell you that I asked one of the economists in GIC, I said that if we face a stock market crash in September or October this year, which is not our baseline scenario, and which is not the scenario he writes to me as to what I should be expecting. But I said, if we have a stock market crash in September, October this year, do you think you can write me a story to say why we should not have been surprised by it? He says, yes, I can write a good story. Well, that's
your answer, then.
That's the world we're in.
Yeah.
Right. From a GIC perspective, since we are in financial investments, I just want to make reference to what I mentioned just now. We expect the Fed to be, let's say, normalizing the interest rates. We know...
You think they will normalize interest rates?
I think a lot of people say we expect them to, right? But then, how the U.S. economy is going...
It's not just economists, they're not committal. You're the same way, isn't it?
No, we are saying, the U.S. economy is slowing down and so forth, so that makes it very difficult for us to say exactly what's going to happen. It's also very clear to us that the market is not pricing in a kind of a deliberate recovery of the interest rate. The interest rates that the market is assuming actually are much lower than anything that has been done in the past, so we're not terribly sure that this is going to happen. We think an accident of sorts. We can be comfortable about the future in the sense of a lot of people know what the sensitivities are, how things might go wrong. But it's like the taper tantrum, you do all these things with the best of intentions, and things do go wrong. So I think there's a fairly good chance that things go wrong. You have all the volatility coming through simply because the intentions may be good, but the readings of the market, and the market reacts a lot faster than you could tell them that they're reading it wrong.
Sure.
So I would be extremely...
That's the biggest risk, is what you think. Bertrand, your thoughts? Thank you very much.
On the very short-term front, I'm still nervous about Greece, and I hope we'll find a solution. I'm confident that reason will prevail, but I'm afraid that some people get used to the idea that a default is technically okay, but misunderstanding the political impact. So that's really for the next months, basically. If I project myself to around 12, 18 months, these are the two variables I mentioned to echo what has just been said. Impact of commodity prices and monetary policy, value of the dollar. These are very important variables. But for me, the biggest risk, the biggest global risk is to be consistent with what I've said, is that if we miss to launch the program to go to the moon, if we miss that, that's really the worst. So we have to start this year to engage on climate, on eradicating poverty together. If we don't start this year, momentum will fade, and then we are back to kind of sad history. I cannot underestimate the difficulty, but I cannot underestimate the importance of where we need to go.
To keep it there.
Yes.
How about yourself, Martin? You have assets in Russia and Ukraine. We had big scares there. Would you put it high in the priority list of risks over the next 18 months?
Yes, I do. Normally, you want to be global because in a normal year, things balance out. You have certain countries doing not so well and others doing better. So last year and this year, this seems not to work because we are only hit by bad news. Argentina, Brazil, Ukraine, Russia, Greece, you could name it. So hopefully, we don't have to talk so much about risk, but see also some more optimistic, some more positive developments next year, where we can basically be a little bit more excited about. The biggest risk I see is the lack of vision of our political leaders and the Chancellor Merkel is a top example. I'm an American, but I'm a German as well. So she is really zero vision. And I think if we continue... Not being said that Hollande is much better. So, but... or Obama. But... what we need to change is we have been focused too long on austerity only, and we need to come up with a vision which is related to growth again. And we have plenty of homework to do, whether it's, as you said, the climate change, or whether it's food security, not only for Africa, but for the world. So we need to be, let's say, a little bit more aggressive and active in coming back to a growth scenario again soon.
Yeah, and that's been stalled for a long, long time. Your thoughts on risk, and then I'll take questions from the floor.
Yeah, I want to come back to Bertrand, and I don't want to go into country risk because they will always come and go, etc. But I think there's a time in history that time is now, that humanity is called upon to reach a higher level of consciousness, to get to a higher moral order, and that time is now. And I think that climate change is the issue that we need to come to grips with. It was Gandhi who said, what we do to the forests of this world is a mere reflection of what we do to ourselves and one another. And as I've often said, we are short of trees and leaders, and we need both of them right now. And do we have the courage? Do we have the courage to put ourselves now to the service of others so that future generations can benefit from this wonderful earth the way we've had it?
Are people willing to sacrifice, though, Paul?
I think more people will. More people will.
It depends where they live. So I think I still worry about Brazil, whatever they talk in public. I'm very concerned about India. I'm very concerned about China. And so, of course, here in Western Europe, we think, we all believe to have the right solutions. We also need to think about how we talk about it. So we need to have a more open global discussion about this subject, including, we talk about Africa instead of with the Africans. We talk about Brazil instead of with the Brazilians. So we need a better dialogue and a better communication between the various cultures and countries of the world.
Good. It's kind of a loaded question for you, Bertrand, but the institutions that were built after World War II and this 70th anniversary outdated? Do they need to be modernized, including the World Bank, in your view, or is it kept up with the times?
No, I mean, we need to modernize, definitely. And that's been my job for the last 2 years. It's difficult because modernizing a bureaucracy, whether it's a private or public bureaucracy, is challenging. But I think we need to, the question of all these institutions is a question of relevance. You have to demonstrate that you are relevant and useful. That is important. Always bear in mind as well that there was a form of miracle in 1944 to create the IMF and the World Bank. I think it would be very difficult to recreate it today. Very difficult. But this kind of noblesse oblige, we've been created with this plan, so we have to be up to the expectations. The world, as I said, has changed dramatically since the Millennium Development Goals. In 2000, everything was focused on aid, limited number of goals. But what happened in the last 15 years? I mean, private sector is key. I mean, public aid moved from 60 billion to 135 billion. In parallel, private flows, whether these are remittances or for direct investment, etc., moved by 10. This is where the money is coming from. It's no longer, I mean, we need this aid, but we need to do more. The first thing. Second thing, the emerging countries have emerged. I mean, in 2000, the BRICS did not exist yet. They were coined in 2001. So we have to adjust to that. And we have had a big financial crisis. As a side comment, we call it the global financial crisis. And the Indian Minister of Finance last year told me, you know, Bertrand, when it's about Europe and America, you call it global financial crisis. When it's about us, how do you call it?
The Asian.
Well,
it was the socialization of American private-owned properties and homes to the world.
Exactly.
So that was the problem.
Right. Democratizing a problem.
And so
yes.
It was a Western-led financial crisis that nobody wanted to
we have to adjust. I mean, in 1944, the World Bank and the IMF were in a monopoly position. There was nobody else. Now we have even new competition from China, potentially tomorrow from the BRICS banks. So it's our job. Competition is healthy. I'm very confident. I'm very comfortable with that. So we have to adjust and adjust and adjust. And we have in particular to engage more and more with NGOs, with private sector, with foundations. The world is changing, and we have to engage together. I was in Luxembourg on my way to Switzerland, and I spent a day with EIB, the European Investment Bank. So you might argue, well, the EIB is about the rich Western Europe. What do you do with these guys? Yeah, but we do the same job. It's about bringing scarce public resources to the benefit of our members. We can exchange ideas, we can spread risk together, and so on and so forth. So we have to work together as a system. It's not about competition perpetuously, it's about cooperation. Again, there is not enough capacity and strength to achieve the way to go to the moon. So we should not be, choosing or picky.
Very good. I'm going to take some questions from the floor. If we can, we have a bunch of hands up, and we have 10 minutes. You have some the microphones here. I'll start here with some of the students. Yeah, please. Can we get? And then where's the other microphone, if we can? Do we have anyone here? Let's take a couple back there too, please. And I just ask that you be very direct and quick with the questions, please.
Hey, my name is Patrick. I'm from Germany. So let me signpost the question. I would like to know, in your global outlook, what part is proudly small? So let me explain. Last year, Professor Neil Ferguson eloquently explained in his keynote the shift from hierarchies toward networks. When we look at companies like Uber and Airbnb, they empower the individual. When you look at the smartphone all over the world and its capabilities, it's going to transform with technology how we live. And we, as human beings, we apply linear thinking towards an age that's becoming more and more exponential. So I would like for you to tell me how you see and imagine the future 20 years from now, and then what are the practical steps to get to that vision and toward that future that you imagine. Thanks.
That's not going to be easy in a minute, but you can try, Bertrand. It's a big question.
Okay. Well, what I see, not 20 years, because I'm working with a 15 years plan, so if you agree with my 15 years perspective, I really see a world where we have eradicated poverty. I see a world where growing inequality are no longer acceptable, where people focus on making sure that the poorest in every country are getting a disproportionate share of the wealth created, contrary to today. That's really the end game. And to get there, you need the proudly small and the not too arrogant big. You need both. You need scale and money. I mean, this is important. But you need to manage this kind of big institution or big bureaucracy in a very agile way. That is a challenge. You cannot be a monolith, unable to think, and sometimes locked in stupidity. You really need to be able to listen to the various signals and the various possibility. I really agree. I mean, just to give you an example, I don't know where we're heading to that, but I met with the founder of Airbnb, to take your example. And he said, I'd like to work with the World Bank. I said, wow, that's interesting. And he took the example of the Sandy in New York. And they were contacted by Mayor Bloomberg to see whether Airbnb can help relocate people from downtown Manhattan, etc., and use the platform. And he said, well, that might be an idea. Airbnb now is present in every country. We have 1 million plus people. So when there is a catastrophe, we should be able to work with the World Bank and other organizations of that type to help relocate people. Wow, that's great. It's combining the big one, because Airbnb is big, while being small, with ourselves and others. So that's the type of reasoning. We should be very flexible and partner. I mean, what I'm convinced that nobody can solve the question alone. But it's difficult because most organizations think they are self-sufficient. They just don't want to work with others. They are self-centered. Look at any large corporate. I mean, I've been the CFO of 2 large corporates, the headquarters, the big tower. I mean, you think of yourself. You forget the clients. You forget what's going in the outside world. That's natural. So you have to keep focused. If I don't want any poor left on Earth by 2030, okay, let's work together. Let's put our heads together. That's, for me, the only fight which is worse today.
Great. We have another microphone back here, please, very quickly. And then do we have the other mic on this side, please? To the gentleman there. Put your hand up. Yeah, there. Thank you.
You're talking about momentum this year, and 43 years ago, the Club of Rome was on that very stage talking about limits to growth, whereafter they came the schools of degrowth and steady growth. What makes this year different? And Paul Polman, thank you so much for bringing this up. Unilever has gone even further beyond their own operations to educate their customers, and the CO2 emissions is great in the actual consumption of goods. Could you provide some concrete tools for the leaders of both tomorrow and today so that when we get back to work on Monday, preferably when we wake up tomorrow, we can actually implement these tools? Thank you.
Yeah, what makes it different now is that the cost of not doing anything is rapidly becoming higher than the cost of doing things. So even for the people that only work with their brain and not with their heart, which I accept at the end of the day, they are starting to see that they need to act. That's why you find more and more companies calling for a price on carbon. That's why 175 CEOs were at the UN, more than heads of states. That's why people are looking at different forms of cooperation. The other thing that I'm optimistic about why it's going to change is the young. If you look, we have now discovered that 80% of the world population is going to live outside of Europe and the US. So that's where you need to find the solutions. Interestingly, half of that population is below 25 years old. A place like Nigeria, 57% of the population below 15 years old. So they're half, the young people are half of that population. They know they're half today, but they know also that they're 100 tomorrow. And they don't want to just be part of shaping the future, they want to be actively shaping the future. When we started in the high-level panel on the Sustainable Development Goals, we created the website of the world we want. We had within 1 week 1 million young people answering. Surprisingly, a lot of them from Africa, with the most amazing ideas and commitments to make this a better world. So I'm optimistic about the young for that reason, and I'm optimistic because for the ones with less of a heart and more of a brain, the cost of not doing anything is rapidly exceeding the cost of starting to do things, which will galvanize ultimately business as well. The final thing is we live in the age of transparency, and people will be flushed out now. The average length of a publicly traded company now has gone down to 18 years. It's very sad. The average length of a CEO is now 4.5 years. It's very sad. The volatility that you see in the... Huh?
In America, it's less.
2.5.
No, but I'm talking about, this is a global panel. So, so the seniority of CEOs, the short-termism that has crept in, I think is starting to haunt the system, and people are starting to realize that. So optimistic for those reasons that we will find an answer, but especially coming from the young, more than anything else, and transparency is going to drive that. When trust is low, when market caps, which I wanted to say, when market caps of companies now go up and down like a yo-yo, like you wouldn't believe it, because we're selling horse meat instead of beef, because we're manipulating LIBOR rates or foreign exchange rates, because we don't invest in the wealth and let them explode, because we think it's cool to buy a $1 t-shirt and have the factory collapse in Rana Plaza. All these things are finished now. They're finished. Just as air pollution is finished in the cities. I have the air quality app on my iPhone. I look at it every day to see what is it now in Beijing and China, or in Shanghai. People don't want to go there anymore to work in companies like ours. We actually have to keep people home sometimes because it's too dangerous. California, industries are moving out. There's no water anymore. In Brazil, in Sao Paulo, they stopped taking showers now. People are starting to see what is happening and are starting to act and rally. And if we can now work together, not to get frustrated about a political process or the complications, but at the end of the day, it's people that make the difference. Who changed the face of racial segregation in the US? It was Rosa Parks who refused to stand up in the bus. She did it. Or it was Martin Luther King. And what we have to watch is the biggest fear is the fear of gradualism, that we think we're making progress, but that is too little, too late. We will make progress. At the end of the day, we want to survive. That's the instinct of human beings. But the thing that we need to focus on is, are we going fast enough? And the strategy of people that have the interest, the vested order, who doesn't want change, which there is plenty of in any big change process, will claim that we will get there eventually. And the trick is, how can we be ambitious enough? So this year, the biggest risk and the biggest challenge, but the biggest opportunity is, do we have the moral authority and courage to be ambitious enough to care in our partnerships, not about the relationship between two businesses or others, but do we care about humanity in its broadest sense? Are we putting the interest of others ahead of our own? Recognizing that by doing so, we would be better off itself as well. How many people want to go to a bar with a friend that you always end up paying for? How many people want to have people in their families that don't show unconditional love to their children and want the best of education and careers and opportunities? Why don't we apply that same principle to our fellow human beings that unite us more than anything else? And yet we focus 100% on driving the differences. In the newspapers, in politics, we thrive on that, not recognizing that we are 99.99% common and that we will only survive if we work together for that humanity. And if you belong in this audience, very simple, if you sit in this audience, you belong to what I call the 2% of the world population that I happen to belong to. I grew up in the Netherlands, education was free, healthcare was free. You know, in many places in the world, it's not the case. 1 out of 20 children doesn't make it past the age of 5. There's still 1 billion people going to bed hungry every night, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. So if you belong to this 2% that we all do, financially independent, can be where we want, sit here, have some very enjoyable 2 or 3 days in St. Gallen, on the board and say, food provided, ice cream free, isn't it our duty? Isn't it our duty to put ourselves to the service of the other 98%? It's the only question I'd leave you with.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to take more questions from the floor, and I see a lot of hands up. This is a very cooperative panel, and I'm sure all of them would like to answer the questions during the breaks and after the lecture, but I apologize because we have one more event to take place here. Let me give a nice round of applause to all the panelists, and I want to introduce our next lecturer.
Okay.